Have you ever watched someone cry for help and seen the world turn its back like they were already dead? In a hospital built to heal, a woman sat crumbling from the inside, out-inured mocked erased because her shoes were worn and her voice too small. They laughed, they filmed, they moved on, believing she was nobody. But in the cold spaces where cruelty thinks it's safe, justice sometimes arrives without warning, and when it does, it doesn't knock. It breaks the whole damn door down. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, harsh and cold, casting everything in a sickly yellow tint that made the cracks in the linoleum floor seem wider, deeper, endless. And in the middle of it all sat Clara, a small figure in a faded cardigan and scuffed sneakers clutching a battered intake form between fingers that trembled not from fear but from exhaustion. Around her the world moved in impatient currents. Families arguing with nurses, children crying, wealthy patients tapping designer shoes against tile as they checked their watches and scrolled through phones, while Clara sat still, invisible, breathing in the sterile air, laced with the scent of disinfectant and something sourer, neglect. She had been there for hours ignored, passed over by name after name, called over the crackling intercom. Each announcement a reminder that in this place urgency was measured not by need, but by appearance. A woman in heels and a silk scarf who had arrived an hour after Clara had already been seen, escorted by a smiling nurse through frosted glass doors into the golden sanctuary beyond, while Clara remained her small voice unheard. Her presence a nuisance the front desk preferred to pretend wasn't there. The pain in her side flared again, sharp and biting, but she still said nothing. She sat still because what else could she do? Speak up and be labeled difficult. Stand and demand help, only to be judged by her worn jeans and tired eyes. No better to endure to hope that maybe pity or protocol would eventually remember her. She glanced at the clock, its mine at hand crawling toward another hour lost, and felt the weight of humiliation settle heavier on her chest than even the pain. Across the room, a cluster of teenagers giggled, one of them holding up a phone, angling it discreetly, or so they thought, toward Clara, snapping a photo, whispering something cruel that made the others smirk. Clara lowered her gaze, cheeks burning, the walls closing in tighter with every second. No one cared who she was. No one even thought to ask. In their eyes, she was just another poor woman, wasting space hoping for charity. She swallowed hard, fighting the sting behind her eyes, telling herself that tears would only feed the story they already believed about her. And somewhere deep inside, something cracked, not a break, loud enough for the world to hear, but a quiet fracture that told her she couldn't do this alone anymore. Her hand slipped into her pocket, fingers brushing against an old worn card she hadn't looked at in years, a number written in clean, sharp ink. She had sworn she would never use it. Had sworn she didn't need the help of someone who had chosen ambition over blood, but humiliation has a way of rewriting old promises. Clara closed her eyes, took a shaky breath, and dialed. The phone call ended before it even truly began. No greeting, no pleasantries, just a single measured voice on the other end after the first ring. "Where are you?" And Clara barely managed to whisper the name of the hospital before the line went dead, leaving her holding the silent phone like a fragile lifeline. She wasn't sure she deserved, her heart hammering against the cage of her ribs, and still she sat, because leaving would mean giving up the only chance she had left, to be seen, to be helped, to be anything other than background noise in this gleaming, indifferent place. She tucked the phone back into her pocket just as a nurse approached the desk, clipboard in hand, her voice pitched high enough for the room to hear. "Ma'am," she said, her eyes scanning Clara with thinly veiled disdain. "We prioritize urgent cases and insured patients first." "You understand, right?" Clara opened her mouth, but before she could speak, a man in a press suit stepped past her, handed over his ID card with a flash of a smile, and was ushered through the double doors without even a glance back. The nurse barely suppressed a smirk. "Maybe next time, come prepared, honey," she muttered loud enough for the teenagers nearby to snicker. One of them, emboldened, snapped another photo, adding a new caption. "Waiting for charity care like..." Clara's face burned, but she didn't move, didn't fight, didn't cry, only clutched the crumpled intake form tighter, the paper bending and warping under the pressure of her fingers as if it too was struggling to hold together. A woman in designer heels leaned over to the receptionist stage, whispering with a laugh, "Can't we put her somewhere else? She's depressing the whole room." The receptionist, a man with perfect hair and a sharper tongue, chuckled. Maybe she's waiting for a miracle, or a GoFundMe. Laughter rippled outward, cold and cruel, and still. Clara sat still. She waited because pride was a luxury she couldn't afford today. Not when the pain in her side threatened to pull her under. Not when she could still feel the last fragments of dignity slipping away 1 second at a time. She stared down at the floor, wishing she could disappear into it, wishing the walls could swallow her whole before the next round of humiliation came. But all she could do was breathe shallow and shaky and hope that somehow, someway the promise that had hung in the silence of that phone call would arrive before the last piece of her shattered completely. The clock above the reception desk ticked louder with every passing minute, each second scraping across Clara's skin like sandpaper. Still, no one called her name. Still, no one offered a second glance. No one saw the way her body hunched tighter against itself in the hard plastic chair like a wilting flower. No one bothered to water. Just when she thought maybe she could endure a little longer, maybe she could keep breathing through the shame and the ache, another voice pierced the room. A young woman in scrubs clipboard pressed against her chest called out for a patient who had arrived nearly an hour after Clara. Her voice syruped sweet as she ushered him back with apologies for the wait. Clara's stomach twisted not from the pain, but from something worse, something bitter and choking, a helpless kind of fury she had never allowed herself to feel, not when she grew up invisible, not when she worked 2 jobs and still counted pennies at the grocery store. Not even when her sister left her behind for a life of gold and glass ceilings shattered, but now, here humiliated in a room full of people who didn't even pretend to care, Clara finally broke. She stood slow and unsteady, her hands trembling so badly the intake form floated to the floor like a discarded hope. She crossed the sticky tile floor to the reception desk. The entire room, pausing, sensing the disturbance in the quiet hierarchy they were all complicit in maintaining. The receptionist looked up with a smirk already forming, as if relishing the chance to swat her down again. Clara's voice, when it came, wasn't loud or begging. It was clear, cold, painfully human. "I've been waiting for 4 hours," she said, her voice cracking only slightly. "I'm in pain. I need help." The receptionist didn't blink. "And as we've explained, we have protocols. People like you can't expect special treatment just because you're impatient." The woman in heels laughed again, softer this time, like a dagger slipping between ribs. Clara's throat tightened. She shook her head, the words she wanted to say, trapped under the crushing weight of despair. She knew how this story ended. She would be told to wait, told to leave, told she wasn't worth the time or the resources. And then in the heavy silence that followed, the doors at the front of the hospital slid open with a sharp hiss. The room shifted. Attention snapped toward the figure that stepped through like a storm contained in human skin. Tall, uncompromising, dressed in a black suit that caught the fluorescent light like armor. Alexandra Steele, Clara's sister. The last person anyone in that hospital had expected to see. She didn't hesitate. She didn't pause. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding, locked on Clara instantly. For the first time that day, someone looked at her. Not with pity, not with disdain, but with the kind of furious protective recognition that made the room feel suddenly too small, too fragile, too insignificant to contain what was about to happen. Clara, still frozen in front of the desk, watched as Alexandra moved toward her, each step a promise, each breath a declaration. When she reached her, she didn't ask what happened. She didn't need to. She simply placed a hand on Clara's shoulder, turned slowly to face the room. Said, her voice slicing through the air like a blade, "Who here decided my sister wasn't worth saving?" The receptionist's smirk died mid-breath, the clipboard slipping from his hand and clattering against the tiled floor with a sound that seemed deafening in the frozen silence that gripped the room. Because everyone in that lobby, from the sneering woman in heels to the bored teenagers filming from the corner, recognized the name Alexandra Steele. Not just from Forbes covers and breaking news headlines, but from whispered stories of mergers that ended dynasties and courtroom victories that left giants bankrupt overnight. And here, she stood in the flesh, radiating a cold fury that made the temperature in the room seem to plummet. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her presence was an indictment all on its own. Clara stood rigidly at her side, still gripping the remnants of her crushed intake form, her heart hammering against her ribs in a rhythm that felt both terrified and relieved, like she had been holding her breath for years and only now remembered how to exhale. Alexandra shifted her gaze, surveying the room with surgical precision, as if memorizing every face, every sneer, every sidelong glance that had passed over Clara, like she was nothing. Her voice when she spoke was low, but razor sharp. "Where is your administrator?" The receptionist stumbled over his words, his hands fluttering like trapped birds. "I can get him. Now?" The command snapped like a whip, and he scrambled away, nearly tripping over the fallen clipboard in his haste. Murmurs rippled through the lobby, people pulling out phones not to mock Clara this time, but to capture the unfolding reckoning, a reversal so complete it felt almost biblical. Clara's cheeks burned with the remnants of shame, but Alexandra's hand remained steady on her shoulder, anchoring her, grounding her, a silent promise that the humiliation she had been forced to swallow would not go unanswered. Minutes later, a man in an ill-fitting suit appeared, his smile brittle and his forehead already sheened with sweat. He extended a hand. Alexandra didn't take it. "Ms. Steele, this is all a misunderstanding. We treat all our patients equally. Stop lying." 3 words delivered so cleanly, so clinically that he flinched. You see her clothes, her shoes, and you decided she didn't matter. You laughed behind desks you didn't earn. You denied care that you were paid to give. You forgot that sometimes the ones you mock belong to families that can end you with a phone call. She stepped closer, forcing him to retreat a half step, his spine pressing against the edge of the desk. "Clara Steele is my sister. And she is worth more than every dollar this hospital will lose because of you." She turned, her voice carrying through the lobby like a decree. Effective immediately, the Steele Foundation is revoking its pending $25 million endowment to this institution. Expect a formal review of your compliance practices and personnel standards within 48 hours. Expect exposure. Expect consequences. The administrator gaped, the blood draining from his face faster than he could form words. Alexandra didn't wait for a response. She leaned into Clara, her voice dropping to something softer, but no less powerful. "You never needed me to fix this, but I'm here now, and no one ignores you again." Clara, overwhelmed by the sudden tidal wave of power and protection wrapped around her, could only nod, blinking back the tears that had finally broken free, not from weakness, but from the first real sense of safety she had felt in years. The phone's filming lowered slowly. The smirks vanished in the room, the same room that had laughed at her mere minutes ago, now could barely meet her gaze. Because Clara wasn't just a poor woman begging for scraps anymore. She was blood to a woman who moved empires, and no one, not even the mighty in their white coats and marble lobbies, could afford to forget it. The hospital director's office, once a sanctuary of quiet luxury, with its heavy mahogany desk and framed degrees lining the walls, now felt like a courtroom, and Alexandra Steele stood at the center of it like a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. No one could counter her black suit, pristine, her heels silent against the polished floor, her presence sucking the oxygen from the room as the director fumbled with his words, trying to balance apology with self-preservation. But Alexandra was not interested in apologies made after consequences had been threatened. She was interested in change written in ink and blood, change that left a mark deep enough to make sure no one ever forgot her sister's name again. She listened to his trembling excuses for exactly 30 seconds before raising one elegant hand to cut him off, her voice. Still calm, still measured, but each syllable sharper than the last. "You will resign," she said simply, as if announcing the weather effective immediately. "Your failure to uphold basic human decency has forfeited your right to serve in any position of trust." The director gaped, his mouth opening and closing like a fish pulled from water, and Clara, standing quietly by the door, watched as the man who had presided over her humiliation crumbled without Alexandra even raising her voice. It should have felt triumphant. It should have felt like revenge. But all Clara felt was a deep aching sorrow that such a reckoning had ever been necessary at all. Alexandra turned, then fixing her gaze on the room's second occupant, the hospital's chief of public relations, a woman in a crimson blazer whose fake smile had been fading steadily since Alexandra's arrival. "Prepare a statement," Alexandra said, her tone brooking no argument. "It will begin with a full public apology to Clara Steele." It will include a detailed plan for restructuring your intake procedures to ensure no patient is ever treated this way again, and it will be approved by me before it is released." She paused, letting the weight of her words sink in before delivering the final blow. "Failure to comply will result in the immediate exposure of your staff's misconduct across every major news outlet and medical accreditation board in the country. You have 1 hour." Without waiting for a reply, Alexandra turned on her heel and swept from the office, Clara following in her wake like a leaf caught in the pull of a tide too powerful to resist. They moved through the hospital corridors, which had fallen into an eerie silence, the staff parting like water around them. No more snickers, no more sideways glances, only wide eyes and whispered prayers that they would not be the next to fall under Alexandra Steele's icy scrutiny. Clara kept her head down, her emotions, a tangle of gratitude, fear, and something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in earshot. They exited into the cool evening air, where the black convoy still waited at the curb, engines humming softly, and for a moment, Clara hesitated, the weight of everything that had happened pressing against her ribs until she could barely breathe. Alexandra noticed. She turned, her expression softening for the first time since she had arrived. "You're not a burden, Clara," she said quietly, so only she could hear. "You never were." Clara's throat tightened, her vision blurring, but she managed a small nod, swallowing the tears that threatened to spill. She climbed into the car beside her sister, the door closing with a decisive click that sounded in Clara's ears like the end of something old and broken and the beginning of something terrifyingly new. As the convoy pulled away from the hospital, Clara looked out the window one last time, watching the building shrink behind her, a fortress that had tried to erase her and failed. Beside her, Alexandra tapped a message into her phone, already orchestrating the next steps of a plan Clara couldn't yet see, but trusted more than she had trusted anything in a very long time. The night swallowed them up, the city lights blurring into streaks of gold and white, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Clara allowed herself to lean back against the seat, close her eyes and truly believe that she was not alone anymore. By the next morning, the hospital was no longer a sanctuary for the privileged few, but a crime scene of reputation where every misstep was illuminated under 1,000 relentless lights. Alexandra had made sure of it, her team of legal and PR specialists working through the night, compiling footage, testimonies, employment contracts, and by the time the sun rose over the city, the Steele Foundation had released a damning report titled "A Place for Healing" or "A House of Humiliation." Complete with time-stamped evidence of Clara's mistreatment, a report so meticulously brutal that even the hospital's strongest allies in politics and media scrambled to distance themselves. News outlets picked up the story, like wildfire headlines flashing across screens and newsstands. "Billionaire sister exposes hospital's ugly truth. Clara Steele, from humiliated patient to national symbol." And while the administrators fumbled out public apologies and announced resignations under pressure, the damage was done, and the donations they had long taken for granted dried up within hours as major philanthropists publicly withdrew support, citing ethical concerns. But Alexandra wasn't finished. In a move no one saw coming, she announced that the Steele Foundation would build a new community hospital just blocks away, one that would serve all patients regardless of income or appearance, staffed by those willing to undergo the most rigorous empathy-based training program the healthcare system had ever seen. A hospital built not just out of concrete and steel, but out of the broken promises left behind by the one that had failed Clara. The third twist came not from Alexandra, but from Clara herself. At a press conference hastily organized by the media, desperate to hear her speak, Clara stepped up to the podium in a simple blue dress, no makeup, no jewelry, just herself, raw and unfiltered. And when the cameras flashed and the microphones leaned in, she didn't rage or cry or deliver a scathing speech. Instead, she spoke plainly, her voice steady, but carrying a weight heavier than outrage. "I didn't want revenge," she said. "I wanted respect. I wanted to matter, without having to carry someone else's last name like a shield. No one should have to prove they deserve to be treated like a human being." Her words rippled through the room, silencing even the most cynical reporters. And when a journalist asked if she planned to leave the city now that she was famous, Clara smiled, not with bitterness, but with something stronger. "No," she said, I'm staying. I'm going to make sure the next woman who walks into a waiting room doesn't sit invisible for 4 hours. I'm going to make sure they're seen before they have to break. In that moment, the crowd stood not because she demanded it, but because she earned it. And Alexandra watched from the sidelines, her expression unreadable, a storm contained behind sharp eyes, and maybe for the first time in her life, she realized that true power wasn't the kind you wielded from a boardroom. It was the kind you lived quietly, stubbornly, bravely, in a world that tried to tell you you were nothing. And Clara had just rewritten the meaning of strength without ever raising her voice. The offers poured in faster than Clara could process them. Hospitals across the country, extending invitations for her to tour their facilities, think tanks proposing honorary degrees in public health advocacy brands that once wouldn't have looked at her twice now, begging her to represent authenticity and resilience. And of course, Alexandra herself, who, in a rare moment of unguarded vulnerability, offered to relocate Clara to a new city, a new mansion, a new life where no one would dare sneer at her again. But Clara, who had spent years learning how to make herself small in the face of judgment, now stood taller than ever, her back straight, her voice clear, as she told her sister, "I don't want to run from where I was hurt. I want to heal it." Alexandra, taken aback for the first time in what seemed like years, studied her with a sharpness that slowly softened into something almost reverent, and though she nodded once with that same businesslike efficiency that could move markets, there was a flicker in her gaze, something proud and protective and a little bit awed. Together, they announced the creation of the Clara Steele Patient Advocacy Center, a revolutionary program embedded inside the Steele Foundation's new hospital project, designed not just to provide free healthcare, but to fundamentally retrain medical staff on the art of respect, empathy, and dignity, with Clara serving as its inaugural director. She refused the salary Alexandra offered, insisting instead that every cent go into hiring advocates to walk hospital floors, everyday eyes and ears, for patients who might otherwise be too scared to speak. When asked by a reporter why she didn't want luxury, didn't want security, didn't want to disappear into a gilded life after all she had endured, Clara simply said, "I didn't come from nothing to become someone else. I came from a struggle so I could help others survive it too." The words spread, quoted in news articles, carved into murals on hospital walls, whispered by girls who had once thought being overlooked was a life sentence. And as the months unfolded, Clara's name became synonymous not with tragedy, but with transformation. And though Alexandra remained a fierce shadow behind her, orchestrating protection and resources and political support, with the same ruthless brilliance that had once terrified her rivals, she let Clara take center stage, understanding in a way only a sister could that this was not her battle to win, but Clara's legacy to write. And Clara, steady and humble and powerful beyond measure, was just getting started. The opening day of the Steele Community Hospital felt less like a ribbon-cutting ceremony and more like a quiet uprising, the kind of moment that didn't scream for attention, but radiated change so powerfully that even the reporters covering it seemed to lower their voices in reverence, and Clara, standing beneath the crisp white banner that read, "Everyone Matters," here didn't wear designer clothes or diamonds or anything to prove who she was now. She wore a simple navy blazer and a name tag that read, "Patient Advocate," because she understood better than anyone that true authority wasn't worn, it was lived. As she led the first tour through the gleaming new halls, pointing out patient lounges filled with natural light and consultation rooms, designed to feel more like living rooms than interrogation cells. The group behind her, nurses, doctors, administrators, listened with the kind of rapt attention usually reserved for royalty, not because of her fame, but because of the respect she had earned one conversation, one quiet battle at a time. Every inch of the hospital was built with dignity in mind. Intake forms that ask not just for insurance information, but for pronouns and comfort preferences, lobbies with no velvet ropes separating private clients from public ones. Emergency rooms where triage was determined by need, not by the cut of your clothes. The Clara Steele standard, as it quickly became known, rippled outward faster than anyone predicted. Hospitals across the state scrambled to revamp their practices to avoid public backlash. Universities added her story to ethics courses, advocacy groups cited her policies as models for systemic reform. And slowly the culture that had once treated kindness as optional began to shift. In one particularly viral moment, a young woman posted a video from a different hospital's ER showing a staff member approaching her with a smile and a clipboard gently saying, "We see you. We hear you. You matter." The hashtag Clara Standard exploded overnight. Yet through all the praise and attention, Clara stayed exactly who she had always been, humble, grounded, relentless in her mission. She spent her mornings meeting with patients who had been wronged, her afternoons training new hires personally, and her evenings sitting with families who needed more than just prescriptions. They needed to be reminded they were not invisible. Alexandra, true to her word, remained in the background, ensuring no bureaucratic obstacle could slow her sister down, using her power not as a spotlight, but as a shield, understanding that the most dangerous thing they could give Clara was freedom. Freedom to change not just one hospital, but an entire system built to forget people like her. And as Clara walked the halls each day, passing by nurses who smiled without judgment, patients who cried from relief instead of fear, and doctors who now measured success not in numbers, but in gratitude, she knew something rare had happened. She hadn't just survived humiliation. She had reshaped the world that once humiliated her, not with revenge, not with rage, but with an unstoppable, undeniable kind of grace that made it impossible for anyone to pretend they hadn't seen her anymore. Clara Steele was no longer a forgotten name on a crumpled intake form. She was a movement. She was a new kind of power, and the world, whether it was ready or not, was already moving in her direction. Months later, when the media frenzy had cooled and the headlines moved on to newer, louder scandals, Clara's impact remained like a quiet revolution stitched into the fabric of healthcare itself, not in grand gestures or viral videos, but in the smallest, most human moments. A receptionist who now looked up and smiled when a patient approached a nurse who knelt to speak to a child, eye to eye a doctor who paused before rushing judgment, because they remembered what happened when Clara Steele sat ignored in a waiting room, and Clara herself never sought to capitalize on her fame. She turned down book deals, reality shows, endorsements, choosing instead to walk the polished halls of her hospital every morning with a clipboard in hand and an open heart, checking on patients, checking on staff, listening more than she spoke, leading more by presence than proclamation. One day during a panel on healthcare reform, a prominent policy expert leaned into the microphone and said, "Alexandra Steele broke industries, but Clara Steele rebuilt humanity," and the room went silent. Not out of politeness, but because everyone knew it was true. Clara didn't abolish the system. She forced it to see itself. And in doing so, she gave a blueprint for dignity that no amount of money could buy and no institution could erase. One particular evening, as the sun set in long golden stripes across the hospital's glass facade, Clara stood by the entrance doors, greeting families as they left for the night, when a little boy no more than 7 tugged at her sleeve and offered her a crumpled drawing, a messy crayon portrait of a woman with a big smile and a cape. "You're a hero," he said, simply before running to catch his mother's hand. Clara knelt there for a long moment, staring at the gift in her hands, not because she believed she was a hero, but because somewhere deep down in the cracked parts of her soul, she understood now that survival wasn't just about enduring. It was about transforming, about refusing to let humiliation be the final word, about becoming the kind of person who doesn't just heal herself, but creates spaces where others can heal too. That night she walked the quiet halls of her hospital. Alone, lights dimmed, patients sleeping, the steady beep of monitors singing soft lullabies of life and hope, and she realized something else. The true legacy she had built wasn't measured in awards or foundations or viral quotes, but in the lives she had touched and the lives those lives would go on to touch in a ripple so wide she would never fully see its edge. Somewhere beyond the city skyline, Alexandra watched the news alone in her high-rise office, glass of wine in hand, a rare smile ghosting her lips, because for all her power, for all her victories, it was Clara who had changed the world, and she had done it the hardest way possible. By staying soft in a world that demanded she turn to stone. The final chapter of Clara Steele's story wasn't about revenge or justice or even vindication. It was about grace, about a woman who sat quietly while the world laughed and stood quietly when the world finally listened and never once lost herself in the noise. And maybe in that there was a lesson for all of us, that the greatest strength isn't in crushing those who once looked down on you. It's in lifting others so high that even the ones who laughed have no choice but to look up. They wanted her to vanish. Instead, she became the storm that no wall could hold back. Clara Steele didn't raise her fists. She raised the standard, every smirk, every laugh, every moment. They thought she was powerless, became fuel for a revolution they will never forget. And now, whenever a stranger sits quietly in a waiting room, maybe the world will think twice before choosing cruelty over compassion, because sometimes the ones you ignore are the ones who will tear your empire to the ground.